Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It is my pleasure to welcome you all to our third and the last Art and Design public lecture of the Department of Art and Design at the Hang Seng University of Hong Kong for this semester. And we are delighted to have our honorable speaker today, our adjunct professor Alexander Law Zhao Wang, Gao Shao. And I would like to invite our Dean, Professor K.K. Tam, to introduce Professor Law.
Thank you, Desmond. Maybe I should introduce Desmond first because they are outside participants. The students all know you. They know who you are. Desmond is an architect, and he's also chairman of the and professor of the Department of Art and Design here. So under his direction are two programs. One is a BA in CCI, Creative and Cultural Industries, and the other is Art and Design. And I think this is a very special occasion that we have two architects here today. One is Desmond, and then Professor Alex Law. I think they share many things in common. So introducing Professor Law is also introducing Desmond. Both of them are architects, both of them are artists. They're painters, and they're also interested in large things about culture, about city, about human life. And in the previous lecture given by Professor Law at Hang Seng University, he focused on psychology and culture. And today he's going to give a lecture on art, language, culture, and architecture. Now, Professor Law is, in the previous lecture, I have introduced him, but I would like to say again, he's chairman of the property developer Yu Tai Hing Company. And he has his own architectural consultancy. And he's also, I know that he oversees a lot of other business, which I think if you know his family, if you know his company, then you know a lot of involvement in Hong Kong business. So he's a successful business leader, but he is different from other business people. He's not just interested in how to make money, but he's also interested in how to contribute to society, how to make his expertise useful to society, how to contribute to the culture, to building up a city. So later on today, we'll have an exhibition of his drawings, and then we can find actually some his vision about the city. So on behalf of the school, let's welcome Professor Law to this lecture.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, honored professors, students, guests, welcome to today's lecture. The title is Architecture, Culture, and Language. Next. Today I'm going to talk about architecture, town planning, and city, because high density living is a lifestyle, and because transportation, urban frameworks is a system, including urban fabrics. Streets are for people. I'm also going to talk about city, its art, culture, and language, and that city is also museum and history, because buildings are antiquities and memories. They are composition of urban landscape, streetscape, and townscape. Next. Introduction, next. Content page, next. Architecture may be classified into 4 simple aspects. First, it is innovative, not repetitive, not a simulacrum. It is futuristic and part of the metaverse, perhaps. Secondly, is anachronistic, not the time duration. It is beyond the historic period and style. And thirdly, it is functionalistic, cater for users' requirement and behavior. And fourthly, it is symbolic, it has a meaning. Hence, a building is designed to last a very long period of time, appertaining to symbolism and has a meaning. Hence, architecture is a culture. A building is designed to become an identity, being itself, and architecture is a language. And on the right-hand side screen, we see the Great Wall of China. It is Chinese art culture. Next. With unintentional changes, city is art and its history. City is culture and its language. 萬不經意地，歷史改變城市，城市就是文化的語言，藝術的生命。With changes through time and space, city is greatest form of art because it is memory, history, and non-verbal expression of humanity, which makes it a splendid language of cultures. City itself is art and is culture. Every city has its own identity. City is culture and its language. City is primary constituent of cultures which are based on languages. City is our history. Every building can be seen as a museum. Man may demise, but matters would remain, including urban fabrics. City is our memories. Through time and throughout human history, city changes, but it never ceases to pertain to sustainable attributes of humanity and art of different cultures with differentiations noticed all over the world. A closer look at art and architecture shows that they are often blueprints of a universal similarity among people of different cultures. They span over a long period of time in way of simulacrum and or anachronism. Buildings, for instance, have functions, symbols, innovation, and meanings. That is why architecture is a form of nonverbal expression of cultures, and it's a language augmented by the status that city and town planning are evolutionary dispositions that make up and shape our lives. Interactions among different cultures are based upon languages, and city is essential to such exchanges. This lecture will look at architecture, town planning, and transportation in Hong Kong and China as well, comparing the current state of affairs and relating them to our past and future with special reference to our counterparts in the West. Next. Every city has its own identity. City is culture and its language. Architectural culture is the variable of cultures around the world affected and created by authentic architectural works, styles, or periods. Architectural language is the innovative and endless progressive vocabulary and language belonging to architecture and used by a clique of architects worldwide. Culture is the customary beliefs, social forms, and material traits of a racial, religious, or social group. It is also a set of attitudes, values, goals, and practices that is characteristic features of everyday existence and way of life when men come together. Languages is meaningful words and methods of communications used and understood by a community or among men and men. It may include art, architecture, poetry, calligraphy, etc. With language, human beings may hold organizational behaviors in collective entities that we may communicate, collaborate, coordinate. Art and design are quotidian living, recurring daily. Mnemonic is something intended to exist, the memory, as a verse or formula. Quixotic art is extravagantly chivalrous or romantic and or visionary. Creativity is the ability to transcend traditional ideas, rules, patterns, relationships, or the like. It may create meaningful new ideas, forms, methods, interpretations, etc., upon originality, progressiveness, and/or imagination with innovation. Art is the conscious skill or creative imagination, especially in the production of aesthetic objects. Design is to conceive, create, fashion, execute, and construct according to the plan out in the mind. Art is controversial in contemporary philosophy. Whether art can be defined has also been a matter of controversy. Art is beyond appreciation of aesthetics, innovation, and creativity of people. Internalization is always meaningful to an artist, a referee, and its externalization is still a subject of an object with originality of a subject. Next. High-rise architecture is our culture, shaping our urban landscape, giving us our lifestyle as China, 1,400 million population, and Hong Kong, 7 million population, speaking our urban language. That is our high-density living lifestyle. This lecture refers to high-density living as megacity in Hong Kong and China. With culture and language, architecture in our cities is high density. Next. On the left-hand side screen, example A, high-density redevelopment, domestic high-rise mixed use with low-density temple use in Tai Po, Hong Kong. On the right-hand side screen, example B, high-density township in Tuen Mun, Hong Kong. Next. Example C. Yeah. Example C, high-density township in Kwun Tong, Hong Kong. On the right-hand side screen, example D, high-density township in Tseung Kwan O, Hong Kong. Next. Architecture is design of buildings into fragmentations and contextualism. Infills are unintentional changes. City is history and is art, a composition of parts and whole. Next. On the left-hand side screen, the street, including a river, is flanked on both sides by two lines of buildings, forming an enclosure. We call them facades. The trees are also part of the streetscape. On the right, two buildings forming an enclosure of open space. There is a tree which is part of the streetscape. There are lamps as street furniture hanging on the tree in the courtyard. A streetscape and a townscape. Next. On the left, the big building at the center is a landmark, and together with some small buildings lining up on the right side, form an enclosure to the central open space, a recreational park. The people in the park are also part of the urban fabrics, as they are decisive to create the imminent townscape, which means the beautiful townscape. On the right, the irregular street pattern is creating an irregular townscape and city framework. The front facades are also irregular that makes unintentional changes, giving an intriguing townscape. Next. On the left, the line of buildings along the waterfront make a colorful prestige. On the right, the top of buildings are different. There are turrets, towers, dormers, flat roofs, and shed roofs, making unintentional changes. These rooftop elements align to make an interesting silhouette. Next. Next. On the left, the roof lines of residing cascades make composition of buildings into fragmentations and contextualism. On the right, irregular street patterns give irregular city forms and intriguing frameworks. Next. On the left, Hong Kong Victoria Harbour is ever changing its waterfronts upon land reclamation all time of the past history. It is Hong Kong culture and speak a language of our own. On the right, Macau has towers, bridges built in all time in different periods of past history, giving Macau its intriguing urban framework. Next. On the left, a German house is built in Shandong province. Shandong was once a German-occupied territory. On the right, this house in Hong Kong is simple and fundamental. This is minor architecture, which I will go into a bit detail later, as every window and details are carefully done. And I want to add a little bit. Minor architecture belongs to everyone. If we are a town planner, if we are an architect, everyone can become an architect or a town planner, because minor architecture look at the details, the fundamentals, like the City Hall in Hong Kong. Every detail is carefully designed, minor architecture. Next. 16 on the left, 16 simple buildings and minor architecture, they are forming an enclosure to the central courtyard. The whole contextual framework is a piece of architecture. On the right, a row of 3 buildings is different as a contextual cluster. Next. On the left, architecture is design of buildings into fragmentations and contextualism. On the right, 16 houses form a precinct among a wider neighborhood. Next. On the left, the precinct is still part of a wider whole, a bigger townscape. On the right, Main Street is an urban framework with enclosures of buildings on both sides. Next. On the left, a street corner of several buildings are unintentional changes. On the right, Aberdeen Technical School is one building composed of several segments. Architecture is design of buildings into fragmentations and contextualism. Next. On the left, the central curtain wall high-rise is a landmark, only 5 years old, sitting over MTR station in Wong Chuk Hang, Island South Line. The trees are also part of the streetscape. The central highway looks quite narrow as defined with the scale of the enclosing high-rise. On the right, the low-rise residences with high-rise in the background is a townscape. Together with the waterfront, they form an imminent urban landscape. Next. Minor architecture with basics, really basics. Everyone can be an architect with basics. Architecture helps shape our townscape, which means that when you walk in the street, you are urban fabric. You wear a red color coat, you are urban part of the city skin, city scene, the townscape, the streetscape, the urban landscape. City is primary constituent of cultures which are based on languages. Next. Not making new iconic buildings, minor architecture rather focuses on repurposing obsolete buildings or previously unsuccessful architecture. In this way, architects should work backwards, using minor architectural elements like doorways, windows, etc., to reactivate an old building. With minor architecture, city building and architecture is a culture and is the language coming from unanimous sources, which is unintentional, without estrangements, no force-fit designers, straitjacket individualism, nor euphemism. We shall now look at vocabulary in buildings, city, and architecture that gives them identity, therefore a culture on their own, so they speak their own languages. Minor architecture works with basics and nothingness, revisiting fundamentals and traits that are variations, hybrid, historic, mnemonic, and or futuristic, so a non-coercive composition makes a city ever-changing, each other destruct or deconstruct in the urban fabrics, making up an urban landscape. Next. As small as a cot or as large as the high-rise, they are merits of minor architecture, that there is evolution from the basics. Buildings or common house assert a basic language, a minor architectural space to exist just because nature and culture approach each other in this reciprocal relationship that rejects the false and destructive distinction between them. This is our minor architectural nature. Next. Deconstructivism is named is a blending of constructivism and deconstruction, a form of semiotic analysis developed by French philosopher Jacques Derrida. This building sketch on the right is unintentional to make composition of unintentional elements in the building, like Jacques Derrida said, to pretend I actually do the thing. I have therefore only pretended to pretend, a minor architecture. Minor architecture appears forward in its own minor immanence. Euphemism is nature against culture. Antagonistic euphemism is an acceptable estrangement to deviate from norms in futuristic buildings, which means that building can be different from what is usually done. It's not opposed, in opposition to any opposing party. It gives the impression of the fragmentation of the constructed building, commonly characterized by an absence of obvious harmony, continuity, or symmetry. So this building sketch composes of composition of random parts. They won't fall. It's a building, it won't fall down. With unintentional changes, city is art and history. City is culture and its language. It is an immanent lifestyle, a composition of parts and whole. Next. At designing stage, the user tenant is yet unknown, but the details are well executed. The very first buildings in Hong Kong are minor architecture, distinguished by a language in architecture. The building has its identity and its culture. It is a landmark in the townscape. Next. The City Hall building was lately announced to become a protected antiquity building. It was designed by Alan Fish and Ron Phillips 60 years ago. All details are refined and carefully done. It is a simple building, a minor architecture. Next. Vertiginous interiors challenge the myth of interiority, which have no limits and there is no vanishing points. Interiors are inviolable, elusive, unattainable. Interior emerges onto the threshold of becoming exterior. The interior of Clock Tower exists in Tsim Sha Tsui Ferry Station, pertaining to such mysticism, a minor architecture. Next. People see and use a building on their own free will. The non-architect expresses the architectural heart, has a heart, a minor architecture. This village sketch is simple, yet the articulation is intriguing, a minor architecture. Next. Monumental building has its own identity, hence it has its own culture, and it speaks its own language, a minor architecture. The architect subject establishes the architect object, which in turn determines the manner in which the client used the space, because this is old China Bank, the Bank of China has one client. Next. Contemporary culture is a social disintegration of the building itself. It also has its own identity, hence this new developers building is a culture and it speaks its own language, a minor architecture. Next. Contemporary culture is a social disintegration of the buildings themselves. The Victoria Harbour gives Hong Kong an exclusive identity on our own culture, so it speaks a language in our own urban context, a minor architecture. Why a social disintegration? Because every building is unintentional. You don't know what's going to happen next year, last year. Reclamation, demolition, new buildings, but the harmony is just like that. It is unintentional. This is townscape. Next. Architecture and the 11th dimension. Next. From last lecture, I talked about the 11 dimensions, and architecture, man, and mindfulness have to fit in each and every one of the 11 dimensions so that we can answer the question of who am I? And the question of who am I is to survive, to live a simple life. And to survive, to live a simple life, we need a good city, a workable city, because buildings become a city? Next. Who am I? We live in a city as a citizen. That's the answer to who am I. Town planning is the job of an architect to serve people. And on minor architecture, all of us are architects. Next. So this is the 11th dimensions. And the 6th dimension, culture and language, is what we are talking about today. It's about culture and language of cities. Each city has different identity. Next. So this is nature before the 0 dimension. Next. The 0 dimension, a point, silence. Next. The first dimension, a line, a strict line of migrant birds. Next. Second dimension, a plain, a flat piece of land. Next. Third dimension, a form. Next. Fourth dimension, the time dimension added to the space. Next. The fifth dimension, character and personality of different persons are different. Next. The sixth dimension, what we are talking about today, culture and language. On the left-hand side screen, we see the Great Wall of China, culture of China. Next. Seventh dimension, beyond the self. Religion, on the left, we see Buddha. Next. The 8th dimension, physiognomy, on the left, we see Buddha said, external appearances is from the heart. 有心無相，相隨心生；有相無心，相逐心滅. So, what William Shakespeare said, all the world a stage. So everyone is an actor. That makes us not true, a bit untrue. But Jacques, the writer, said, to pretend, I actually do the thing. I have therefore only pretended to pretend. So pretending to pretend is not untrue. Next. So the 9th dimension, authenticity and antagonistic euphemism, is pretended to pretend. Antagonistic euphemism is explained like this. Antagonistic meaning doing something opposing the things it is already agreed. And euphemism is doing something against something which is done, agreed. So, but it's okay because you don't love yourself. It's true. That's a true you. It's a true self. You don't love yourself. You don't have to hide. That is authenticity. Next. 10th dimension, love. Next. 11th dimension, interpersonal relationship. And in the man-man dimension, that is the city. Next. So culture, language, and unintentional change. Next. So on the right, you see the Moscow Cathedral, and it is now a museum. When it was designed, it is never intended to become a museum. So a city is constantly changing. Every time it's changing. Not to say that the subject is changing. When you look at the object, how the subject is interpreting what he is seeing is different. So a city is a greatest form of art. Why? Because it is always changing. Next. The nature and man interface. Next. On the left is a castle, a hotel in Quebec, Canada. Beyond it is the forest, the nature. You have to protect it. On the right is the Victoria Harbor of Hong Kong. You have to protect the water, which is nature. Next. Sketching. Next. Now I read the top right left-hand corner on the right left-hand side screen, the red box. Architecture and town planning is the job of an architect to serve people. And on minor architecture, all of us are architects. Sketch is design, and to conceive, create, fashion, execute, and construct according to the plan out in the mind for the enjoyment of use of people. There's a purpose. We try to do a sketch so it becomes finally a product. Of course, if it is a piece of painting, it depends on how the subject is going to see the object. And on the right, it is the sketch that I did. Next. Some more sketches, next. More sketches, next. On the left is a sketch I did in the middle of the night when I was in a bar with my wife in Osaka 20 years ago. Now it is a development with 12 buildings. It's just with a little bit of a piece of paper and 2 pens. And on the right is another sketch I did in the morning after, and it is Osaka townscape. You see the irregular townscape and the undulating natural landscape at the behind the townscape, the background. Next. Classical Chinese architecture. Next. So while culture is inherent to development of the long history of human habitat, we envisage language as an element parallel to culture, changing as a new arising culture may occur in a regional context. We can review typical typologies of classical Chinese architecture as a culture of Chinese people. On the right-hand side screen, the 9 elements, 亭台樓閣廊謝軒橋塔 pavilion, terrace, building, pagoda, colonnade, portico, porch, bridge, tower. Next. It is a poem and a drawing I made for the 9 elements. Next. The first element, pavilion, 亭, an important building in Chinese garden mainly built on roadside or waterside. It serves as a resting area for pedestrians to enjoy views. Normally, it is an open structure without walls. The rooftop can be of various shapes. Next. On the left, a drawing and a poem I did. On the right, example, 最雍平. Next. The second element, terrace, toy. The building is a square-shaped terrace which was originally used as an observatory or religious site, but later become a type of palace. Next. On the left is a poem and a drawing. On the right is example, 武陵松台. Next. The third element, building, 樓. The building tower is a building with multiple stories having an important role in the past. For example, Tripitaka Library in the temple. They are typically found in Chinese gardens, commonly used as a bedroom, study room. Next. On the left, drawings and poems. On the right, example, 黃鶴樓. Next. The fourth element, pagoda, 閣, one of the Chinese traditional buildings, which is an overhead building in square, hexagonal, octagonal shapes. Usually has 2 stories, similar to the tower, but much smaller. They typically have doors or corridors with a view and are used for studies or religious use, or can be used as a bedroom. Next. On the left is drawing and poem. On the right is example, 鳳來閣. Next. Fifth element, colonnade, long. Colonnade means covered walkways at first, then developed into different types. For example, long corridors, short corridors, cloisters, etc. Usually used to connect 2 buildings or spots for avoiding strong wind and rain. In Chinese garden, it's a sightseeing route to connect all the buildings in the garden into one. Next. On the left is drawing and a poem. On the right is example, 頤和園長廊. Next. The sixth element, portico, 謝, construct on terrace or near water or partly or complete over water. The feature only has columns and windows, no walls. Next. On the left is a drawing and poem. On the right is example, 水心謝. Next. Seventh element, porch, 軒, a long corridor or small house with a window. Mostly is a spacious building, but not on a big scale. Porch has different types of and shapes, similar to a widened corridor, which is one type of building to embellish the garden. Next. On the left is a drawing and poem. On the right, an example, 雨水重座軒. Next. The eighth element, bridge, 橋. A bridge is a structure built to span a physical obstacle, such as a body of water, valley, road, or rail, without blocking the way underneath. In Chinese traditional gardening architecture, The bridge is used to connect the road at both sides of the waterfront and not blocked by the lake, hence to gild the way. Bridge also contain many art forms, can act as an important scenery together with water and plants to form a complete view. Next. On the left is a drawing and poem. On the left right is an example, 頤和園玉帶橋. Next. The ninth element, tower, top. Tower is one of Chinese traditional architectural element that is common in traditional Asian buildings. The main purpose of the structure is for storage of Buddha statues, scriptures, or remains of monks. Next. On the left is a drawing and poem. On the right is the example, 飛鴻塔. Next. Western architectural periods. Next. We review architectural cultures and language on the entire Western architectural period of various styles. Architectural period is a length of time in the world of architectural history that predominantly identifies a certain architectural style. Architectural style is the particular architectural style of buildings and architectural works belonging to a particular architectural period and affecting parts or whole of architectural culture and languages. On the right is the names of the different periods. Next. The Greek periods, we look at the columns and the capitals, the Doric order, the Ionic order, the Corinthian order. And on the right is the example Parthenon. Next. The Hellenistic period, the theatrical tendencies of the Corinthian order. On the right, we have the example in Turkey. Next. The Roman period, the classical Greek period, Greek architecture evolves to become the Roman concrete as the arch and the dome is strong and well engineered. On the right, we see the example Colosseum in Rome, which is estimated to carry 50,000 to 80,000 spectators. Mind you, it is built about 2,000 years ago. And you see the drawing of the keystone. There's no concrete at that time. Roman concrete. I have to ask Desmond if there are reinforced concrete at that time. Next. Byzantine architecture. Churches and basilicas, rounded arches, golden mosaics, sinus lines, and naturalistic forms. On the right is an example in Turkey, and the drawing shows the dome and the arches. Next. Medieval architecture, Romanesque period, the medieval Europe and the semi-circular arches. Each building has clearly defined forms, frequently of very regular symmetrical plan. The overall appearance is one of simplicity. On the right is an example in Toulouse. Next. The medieval architecture, the Gothic style, the pointed or ogival arch, the rib vault, the flying buttress, the tracery, and the stained glass windows. On the right, we have the example in France. Next. Medieval architecture, perpendicular style, is the English Gothic style, typified by large windows, four-centered arches, strict vertical and horizontal lines in the tracery, and regular arch-topped rectangular panel. On the right, we have an example in England, and we see the drawing, the four-centered arch. Next. The Renaissance architecture, a conscious revival and development of certain elements of ancient Greek and Roman thought and material culture. On the right, we have an example in Italy. There you see the statues of classical deities on top of the pediments. Next. Mannerism architecture, late Renaissance, solid and spatial relationship, harmony and rhythm, and you can see an example in Italy. Next. Elizabethan architecture, pluralistic, fenestration, vaulting, techniques, open truss. And on the right, we see the example in England. Next. Baroque architecture, highly decorative, theatrical style, domes, colonnades. The interior effects giving the illusion that one is looking into the heavens. Light is also used for dramatic effects. Twisted columns were also often used. In Baroque palaces, grand staircase became a central element. On the right, we see an example in France, the famous Palace of Versailles. Next. The Rococo architecture, the late Baroque, ornamental, theatrical style, architecture, art, decoration to create surprise and the illusion of motion and drama. Exuberant decoration, the exteriors of Rococo buildings are often simple, while the interiors are entirely dominant by their ornament. On the right, we have the example in Russia. Next. Neoclassicism architecture, a revival of classical architecture. A neoclassical architecture is characterized by grandeur of scale, simplicity of geometrical forms. On the right, we have the example in USA, the Capitol building. Next. Art Nouveau architecture, a movement rather. Art Nouveau was more a kind of detail than it was a style. Asymmetrical shapes, extensive use of arches and curved forms, curved glass, plant-like embellishments, mosaic and stained glass. And on the right, we see the example of Paris metro station designed by Hector Guillemot. Next. Beaux-Arts architecture, French neoclassicism on sculptural decoration, conservative modern lines. On the right, we see an example in France. Next. Georgian architecture, proportion, balance, regularity, Georgian town planning. On the right is a lovely example of the circus, a townhouse, and you have the circular segments, 3 segments surrounding a circular courtyard with a tree at the center, designed by John Wood. And John Nash is a famous architect in the period. Next. Victorian architecture, interpretations and eclectic revivals of historic styles. On the right, we have the example in England. Next. Edwardian architecture, neo-Baroque architectural style. Sir Christopher Wren is a representing architect in the period. That's why sometimes his name is used to call the period Renaissance. And Sir Edwin Lutyens is another famous architect of the period. And on the right, we have the example in England. Next. Art Deco architecture, aesthetics, structures that were fresh, modern, and unlike previous revivalist styles. And on the right, we have the Chrysler building in New York City, USA. Next. International style, modernism, modern architecture, volume over mass, the use of lightweight, mass-produced industrial materials, and the use of flat surfaces, typical alternative with areas of glass. And on the right, we have the example Seagram building in New York City in USA, and designed by B.S. Randiro and a group of architects. And notice, it is a curtain wall building, and it was built 60 years or more ago. Next. Modernism architecture, minimalism, involves the use of simple design elements without ornamentation or decoration. The style, Rotterdam Group in Netherlands, led by Piet Mondrian, and Bauhaus School, in Germany, Weimar, led by Walter Gropius. And on the right, we have the famous example, Barcelona Pavilion, Spain, built in 1929 and rebuilt in 1986, designed by the famous architect Ludwig B.S. van der Rohe. Next. Modern architecture, constructivism. Constructivism is following the Bauhaus School also. Constructivist art movement is tending to modern technology with engineering methods following the social, political ethos of communism. And on the right is an example in Russia. Next. Postmodernism architecture, deconstructivism. Deconstructivism is the movement of postmodern architecture, fragmentation of constructed building, an absence of obvious harmony, continuity, or symmetry. Deconstructivism is the blending of constructivism and deconstruction, a form of semiotic analysis developed by French philosopher Jacques Derrida and his famous verse, "To pretend I actually do the thing, I have therefore only pretend to pretend," which means that antagonistic euphemism is an acceptable estrangement to deviate from norms in futuristic building. That's why the example doesn't like the normal building. This is the Run Shaw building in City University, and it was built in 2011 and by the famous architect Daniel Libeskind. Next. Post-Modernism architecture, high-tech architecture, the structural expressionism, late modern architectural style, high-tech industry, technology, transparency in design and construction, structure and function. And on the right is the example, the Pompidou Center in France. It was said that the center of the building was liberated for use, no columns, no ductings, no mechanical parts. The ductings and mechanical parts are removed to the external walls and the roof of the building. Next. Now I'm going to the town planning part of today's session. Next. China fast-growing polynucleated cities and high-speed train transportation network. Next. In this lecture, I'm talking about town planning, urban frameworks, and urban fabrics because they are all important to the high-density living pertinent to our imminent lifestyle. Architecture is art. City is the composition of buildings in part and in whole. Buildings are history, museums, and memories. We also look at some demographic figures because China is growing very fast with its transportation network and its organization to go beyond the creation of metropolis and megapolis. That is, China is creating milieux, a group of cities. For example, the Greater Bay Area, Taiwan Corridor. As well, Hong Kong is preparing to create this northern metropolis joining Shenzhen border as announced by Chief Executive Carrie Lam on October the 6th last year. Amazingly, China is doing well with its high-density spots and high-density megacities. And China is still keep its wisdom to preserve old cities, pedestrian streets in low-rise neighborhood, that is, streets are for people. In this way, the high-density megacities in China become development that can release plentiful spare land resources for recreational and institutional purpose, hospitals, schools, universities, etc., and preserve the natural landscape intact. Other social, economical issues are addressed as well. The abundance of agricultural land arising out of high-density lifestyle avoids stagnation, irrational exuberance, unemployment, and increased supply of agricultural products, especially assist economic growth in old cities and inland provinces of China. Next. Now let's look at the diagram on the right-hand side screen. The circle is a town planning scheme called the Ebenezer Howard's Garden City model, done in 1898 in the UK. And on the peripheral circumferences are the satellite cities, or they call the garden cities. And on the center is the CBD, the Central Business District. But what is important is the link, the radii, that link up the satellite cities with the center. These are the municipal railways. And we look at the map on the left-hand side screen now. It is the Guangdong province map. 21 mega cities. I have to say mega city. because the smallest one of them is called Yongfu, the dotted line. Yongfu population is 2.4 million, same as Chicago, which is the third largest city in United States. And there are 18 prefectures, these megacities surrounding three principal cities, Guangzhou, Shenzhen, and Hong Kong. Principal cities, respectively, their population 18.5, 17.5 million, and Hong Kong has 7 million, growing to 10 because Carrie Lam announced that the North metropolis is going to house 3 million people in 20 years. And we notice also that the Yongfu population is same as the 10th largest city in United States, San Jose. And mind you, Fujian is Fasan. Population is 9.5 billion. It's already higher than New York City, which is 8.4 million. And Fujian is the fourth largest megacity in the province of Guangdong. And why we are saying this? It is a circle of satellite cities surrounding the three principal cities. And how can they do that with the population of 126 million in the province? They have the metro, the high-speed trains, and they have the municipal railway working in every one of each of those cities. And that's why they can do what the Americans cannot do, because they have the garden cities, the low-rise houses in the suburban areas. Every day they have to be very troublesome with the traffic on the expressways going to the CBDs. So I read what I did in the text in the left-hand side screen. China is serious in long-term planning, well ahead of time on public transportation, especially with high-speed train and networking. Polynucleated cities are successful results and become important for urban growth in high-density metropolis, networking efficient communication. China is successful building up a vast mass transportation and high-speed train system starting operation in 2007, still under vigorous advancement and beyond. We would recall the words of Louis Mumford, who is a famous USA town planner in the 1970s, who emphasized the importance of public municipal transportation system and the mass transit underground, municipal railways, plus the bus system. If you live in Toronto, you know how different it is, because Toronto has bus and Los Angeles doesn't have bus. So it is a pain, really, to live in some of those cities and to carpool. You have to carpool, share a car to get from one point to another. The bus system to alleviate the burden of daily congestion of motor cars using the expressways going to the central business district. He also suggested limitation on population density and urban growth to promote efficiency. He championed the 1898 Ebenezer Howard Garden City models, ideals with his work on polynucleated cities. And on the right-hand side screen, Louis Mumford's writing on transportation of USA city, he did it in October 1970. Transportation neglected suburban service and the rate of deterioration will increase. So what is needed is a new national policy aimed at overcoming the transportation crisis, that local services should be renewed. Planes and motor cars cannot help the private traffic forward into the central built business areas daily. And the subsidized expressways has proved it as inefficient as it is extravagant. Cheap means of transportation superimposing the old subway lines of big cities is the only escape route to help transportation as a means of rescue of the poor minorities in many cities who are unable to travel point to point for lack of a model car or a bus service to find work in other areas. Next. So now on the left is the map of Guangzhou, a city. On the right is the American country map. And we have on the central is the Chicago, on the west coast is the Los Angeles. And mind you, comparing to the population, they are just the first and the second county in Guangzhou, Baiyun, and the Panyu, same. It is not about who is doing right or wrong with high density. But later, I'm going to talk about why the high density system is helping China to get through what the problem they have. So I read the box, the red line box on the left-hand side screen. Apart from avoiding traffic congestion in expressways going to CBD from suburbs, unlike USA, China achieved the resolution of other socio-economic issues as well. More lands are released for natural landscape, agricultural use, institutional use, hospital, universities, etc. And more open space, old cities, urban fabrics, and vernacular architecture are preserved. So in China, when you go to China, you're surprised that the first time you go to China, you see all agricultural lands. It looks like it is very primitive until you go to later, you see some pictures. Next. Now, I show on the far right, the chart, which has the yellow highlight, Panyu, which is the second largest county of Guangzhou city. And this is 2.6 million. It is compared same as the smallest city in Guangzhou, Guangdong province, the Yunfu, the dotted line in the map on the left-hand side. Yunfu has 2.4 million. So a city, and that is county. So that you see how people are pouring in to the coastal areas and form naturally. They are not national or municipal policy, but naturally people come together and form the big mass of population in Guangdong province, the millions. Just to mention, Foshan, the number 4 city, has 9.5 million. Next. So on the right-hand side screen, I highlighted green, the IT millions in Greater Bay Area, Taiwan Corridor. And underneath is yellow color highlight, Guangdong province, 126 million. And the Greater Bay Area, 86 million. 70% people live in the Greater Bay Area, which Hong Kong is part of it. And underneath is 2 red color box. It's a Shenzhen, Shenzhen, and Guangzhou population box. They grow 40 years. They grow from 0.314 million to 17.5 million in Shenzhen and 0.646 million to 18 million in Guangzhou. And that is 2020, 2 years ago. You never mind what happened in these 2 years. And on the left-hand side screen, you see the speed of the timeline. 100 years ago, the communists first meeting of the National Congress in 1921. Now is the 20th meeting, 20大. And then 65 years ago, it is 1953, they have the first 5-year plan. And now it's the 14th 5-year plan, that's 14個5年計劃. And then 1954, the 4th modernization, 4個現代化. And then 1978, the opening up policy, 改革開放. 2003, the scientific development concept, 科學發展觀. That makes the IT becoming stronger and stronger in China. And let me hope that China is not going to the dead end route, with the IT because they are really relying on the IT industry and the economy quite a bit. And in 2008, empty the cage and let the right birds in policy. It is an ERP policy, enterprise resource planning policy, 騰籠換鳥, which means that in the province of Guangdong, no more old industry because the wages of people are higher, the living standards are higher. The old industry have to move inland, which means that this high density living is helping China, all the 34 provinces of China, the inland provinces. The free and the 2009, the free old transformation policy, 三舊改造, old towns, old factories, and old villages. This is government policies. And that all makes the China survive, not to say anything affluent. And in the year 2007, the high-speed train started. Next. Now, on the left, you see the map of the Taiwan Corridor, the Greater Bay Area, and Guangzhou at the center. And on the bottom right-hand of the left-hand side screen, you see the three circles. These are the Northern Territory, Northern Metropolis, as announced by Carrie Lam last year, October the 6th, in the policy address, that it is the Northern Metropolis going to house 3 million people in 20 years. And notice the red dot on the left-hand side circle, 前海區, 前海. Later, you are going to see a picture. And now on the right, you see the big box, 600,000 agricultural village in the whole country of China. And you cannot do too much. You are not going to buy lands from them. Otherwise, they become very rich. You release the agricultural, recreational, institutional land use. And that is the goodness of the high rise policy in China. But lately, we know that at least I know that from the news, that China is trying to control the prices of real estate in the domestic sector, at least in China. Next. So on the left is the Qinghai photo. This picture is 10 years old. Next. Now we come to Hong Kong town planning. Next. Chief Executive Carrie Lam announced that the Northern Metropolis last year, October the 6th. 20 years, we will have 3 million people in that sector. Next. So the concept, next. Healthy city, next. We have to be very careful with town planning. Town planning is not just how to enjoy life. Today, we still have the pandemic, the COVID-19. So this is very important that Lim Jing-choi, members of the Executive Council, proposed that prevention focused but over the treatment oriented, that these are other social economic issues shall be addressed as well in town planning. Next. The BEAM theory. Next. We look at Mr. Yu Guogli's BEAM theory, recalling to West Kowloon and Hong Kong vernacular architecture as a historian to see economy, context, and society as realm of modern architecture versus cultural renaissance revival, which is essential to our urban existence. Next. Number one, every building can be seen as a museum. Of course, a museum itself is a museum. Buildings give city its character, taste, and features. Some buildings are antiquities. Number two, town planning is encompassing enjoyment of use, urban fabrics that make the city has its values and beliefs City has its daily lifestyle. Number three, city and culture interact in their relationships. Every minute there is a change. These changes are recorded and exist or become metaphors, a history. City is the culture itself, its history. We should look at 油麻地、尖沙咀、旺角、油尖旺 as well. Those are the old cities. We have to look after. We have to look after the open space, the old streets. Without the streets, how can we see the urban fabrics? There are urban frameworks also. Number four, city is layers and layers of history adding up to. We are willing to rehabilitate and reuse old buildings. History of cities may span beyond thousands of years, even longer than history of nations. It is conservation and reuse of old buildings. Number five, historic sites is everywhere in our cities. City, who am I? That is, beliefs and values, environment and history, art and creativity, memory. Number six, we look at city from social economic context. They always change and interact. We should see the time dimension in city history and growth in space and its urban fabric, vernacular architecture, old city, urban fabrics, and open space. Number seven, culture may establish a city's position and character. Without culture, a city becomes an old man, losing his or her memories. City itself is art and its culture. Number eight, we have to make our best efforts in rebuilding, as there is not many chances to design and rebuild a building. To pull down an old building is a dilemma, as old buildings are precious urban fabrics. Number nine, city is an art, and culture and art is creation and vice versa. An artist's renaissance is never ending, that modern art appears in many forms as our contemporary artists are multifaceted. Next. This is the West Kowloon Cultural District scheme, one of the largest one in the world. And it is very much about art and entertainment facilities. Next. Now, the reuse of building conservation. Next. It's a pawn shop in Wan Chai Johnston Road, now used as a coffee shop. Next. Resettlement estate turned into a hotel. Next. Welfare center turned into a school. Next. Staff quarters turned into a school. Next. In Yintai, Shantung, buildings turned into hotels. Next. It is in Hong Kong, high-rise and low-rise turned into hotels. Next. More high-rise, low-rise turned into hotels. Next. Low-rise turned into hotels. Next. City and streets. Next. Very important. Streets are our urban frameworks. They are our open space. Streets is most viable open space that we use every day to come and go to and from our home. Children use streets as open space to play as a recreational resources. And street is very important. Without street, how can you see your urban fabric? What you call museum memory. So street is very important. They are also our memories. Next. Streets, townscape, neighborhood, streetscape, urban fabrics. Next. Age of locomotion, predetermined streets. Next. Romantic principles, they are all urban fabrics. Next. New villa districts, these houses are like precious jewels, making streets and city our museum. They are all urban fabrics. Next. Military streets. Next. Stepped streets, they are urban fabrics. Next. Admired for their length, these long and wide motor vehicle streets have lost the glamour of streets for enjoyment of use of people. Next. Destruction, we lose old buildings that are memories, museums, as they are urban fabrics. Next. Unsightly streets, we should rehabilitate and improve the old buildings and the old cities to preserve vernacular architecture and urban fabrics. Next. Developers' paradise. High-rise development may solve population growth into high-density spots with mass transit railways connected on a point-to-point system with covered street pedestrian malls on top of stations or for enjoyment of use of people. Quite successful in Hong Kong yet. Next. Could it be said that Shakespeare walked the streets of Venice, Verona, or Padua? Theatric, romantic, Hong Kong and China shall achieve to provide open streets for vernacular architecture and covered street malls. And I think a university like Hang Seng University, Hong Kong, has the art and design school. It's very important in the future to make this happen. Next. Theater, idealized the streetscape and covered street malls. Next. Musicians in the open streets turned them into theaters and open street malls. Next. Streets and avenues was valued as a symbol of progress. That is true. If that is true, let's hope that there will be reprovision of streets for enjoyment of use of people. Next. Sidewalk cafes on the right, we see it in Hong Kong. Next. Internal street malls, the Pacific Place on the right. Next. The covered streets, the Temple Street on the right. Next. Now, the city plan, very complex, very hardworking. But we really have to remember China is benefited with the municipal railway system and the high-speed railway system. And we have to thank you some other model. It's only my imagination that Ebenezer Howard Garden City model is a copycat with the China version. Next. We have to remember preservation of our most viable open space, the old streets, and the provision of new covered street malls above mass transit stations, even though the gridiron fashion is going to be most efficient. Next. Conclusion. Next. So from the first lecture, who am I? Next. Town planning is the job of an architect to serve people. And on minor architecture, which we have discussed it, all of us are architects, but some are trained. But all of us are architects, all of us are men. All of us have the mindfulness to become mindful. Every city has an identity. Every city is art. With architecture, culture, and language, we live in a high-density city. We provide for agricultural, institutional, recreational land use, urban fabrics, old city, vernacular architecture, and open space. That's the answer to who am I? Next. China is networking new mileages, polynucleated cities. China high-speed train transportation network and the municipal railway and bus system. The bus is very important. It's helping us to pull in the people into the coastal areas, into high-density areas like Seichun. Seichun, I forget off my mind right now, the capital of Seichun. But those are huge population hubs that it's done because there is the high-speed rail. And on the right-hand side screen, we see the Hong Kong Northern Metropolis. And it is our hope, at least it is my hope, that Hong Kong is going to grow with China peacefully, without the war right now in Europe. Next. On the left, we have the Guangdong Map again. Remember, the Ebenezer Howard Garden City makes the 18th city surrounding the 3 major cities in Guangdong. And the 4th largest city, Foshan, is already 9.5 million more than New York City. And there are 34 provinces in China and over 600,000 agricultural village. And agricultural country, we have our agricultural products. So let's have a peaceful life. Next. So with architecture, city has a unique culture. With architecture, cities speak its own language. Architecture makes our urban fabrics. City is a composition of parts and whole of architectural elements. Every city and every building has an identity. Architecture is art, culture, and language. City is primary constituent of cultures which are based on languages. City itself is art and its culture. City is our history. Every building can be seen as a museum. Man may demise, but matter would remain, including urban fabrics. City is our memories. City and buildings are art, museums, and creativity, history, memory. Silhouette, facades, and forms are urban landscape of our habitat. We live in high-density cities. We preserve urban fabrics, old city, vernacular architecture, and open space. Streets are for people. Open streets, not just the covered streets. Next. Scale of streets, very important. Narrow street, very good. Wide street, very good. But the scale of street, how you manipulate with the building and closing the streets are very important. Scale of streets and urban fabrics compatible with the enjoyment of use of people. On the right, we see the Broadway in New York City. This is a pedestrian street that they no cars. Otherwise, it's a motor car street. So in Hong Kong or in China, we have to appreciate our old city, our old streets. We need streets that are open space. As citizens of cities, we have duties to preserve our vernacular architecture, old city, urban fabrics. Cities are for people. Streets are for people. High-rise cities have streetscape, townscape, urban landscape, and streets are viable. And we can see the Pacific Place on the right-hand side screen. It is okay, Christmas time, very happy. But the open streets, our urban fabrics are there. We have to look at some of the buildings in Happy Valley are very, very nice to me. Next. Streets are for people. Every city is art. Vernacular architecture is viable. Let's live a simple life. Every city has its urban fabrics and frameworks. What is frameworks? How streets are forming the patterns in the city. Districts, they are frameworks. Streetscape, townscape, urban landscape. So city is architecture, culture, and language. And at the end, it's the box on the right-hand side screen that is a sentence that I wrote that I learned from this lecture. With unintentional changes, city is art and its history, city is culture and its language. 萬不經意地，歷史改變城市，城市就是文化的語言，藝術的生命。Next. Let's end this lecture by learning from motto of HSU Hong Kong. Let us, and all of us, to creativity and leadership and good health. Next. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex, Professor Law, for your very illustrative, very comprehensive lecture. You know, it's covering architecture of East and West, from building, what you call mine architecture, you know, to town planning, you know, and then to the streetscapes and to, you know, the whole blueprints of developments, both mainland and Hong Kong. I think this is a very rich, very complex lecture, incorporating so much of your knowledge and your experience, and to share, with our students and our staff, right? So we still have about 10 minutes, perhaps, for the audience. Oh, we have the questions already. So may I ask Samson to help me read out, what the question is?
Okay. The lecture is most informative and illuminating. May I hear a bit more about how an architect and culture preservationist to resolve the dilemma or tension between putting down buildings and buildings new building. And as you mentioned, architecture is a part of our culture, history, memory, and identity. Is there a way to strike a balance between the needs for the city redevelopment on the one hand and the preservation of local culture, art, and city identity? Thank you very much for your wonderful lecture with clear and detailed elaboration on the topic pretend and pertinent to our current urban life in Hong Kong and the future development of the city. Maybe the main point should be at the center of this part.
First of all, to tear down a building is no more easy now than 10 years ago. And redevelopment is becoming bigger, like the one in Hong Kong. It is one of the biggest urban renewal scheme ever happened in Hong Kong. It's done by Henderson, Hangge, Xiu Yip. And why I have to mention that those areas, I have to say, is quite run down by itself. And the buildings are over 50 years old. So that is a natural cause that some of the areas would disappear. But buildings in Happy Valley, for example, it's not easy to take away. And we have to balance off what we can do and what we shall do. People are doing business and they have to live their lives. In the last 3 years, it's not easy to get over. I have to really say, a lot of companies are working hard to get over what they get hurt. But what I am trying to refer to is the old building, the urban fabrics, how we protect them. In fact, I met a lot of experiences, occasions that we cannot tear down old buildings. Some of them in the town plan, we call them the OEZP, the outline zoning plan. They are zoned GIC. O means open space, GIC means government, institutional, community use. And you cannot easily remove those buildings. Exactly, I'm thinking about a temple building. It doesn't look like a temple, but it's a temple itself. It's a 50 years, about 50 years, it's more than 50 years old in Kam Long Tai. Dragon Terrace in Causeway Bay. You cannot tear it down. They really want to, the owner want to tear it down, but I can do nothing to help them. And reprovision and conservation is something that would be dealt with. I presume that government is doing their best effort, trying their best effort to make preservation, conservation of buildings, like the King's College in Bonham Road, or the Queen's College in Causeway Bay. It's not easy that you are going to take those buildings away. Those buildings are memories. And for example, the police stations and perhaps some of the fire stations. The fire stations, even though they doesn't look elegant, but they are memories. But police stations, a lot of the police stations are very good landmarks. I myself, from my youth, there are at least 5 police stations that occurred to me once in a while. And legislation, I believe Carrie Lam is putting a bit midnight oil on redevelopment. But I think in the next phase, the Hong Kong government would do more to preservation, conservation with quality old buildings. And especially the old street, like the Li Dong Gai, the Li Dong Street in Wan Chai. I won't comment if it is good or bad, but at least they have their efforts to make a preservation of the, you call it a pressing, but it's transformed. It's very much, to me, it's very much transformed. But it can be real. Someone can do better. I just put an example, Leidong Street. There are Santao Gai, Shuaitao Street. Those few streets should be maintained with their vernacular nature. They really have the taste of Hong Kong, that part of Wan Chai, not just the pawn shop, a open street, a pedestrian street. You don't tear down buildings and redevelop just because of money. That's my comment.
Just on this point of conservation, I just want to bring up, in this morning I had in my own lecture, my class lecture, I showed them, this underground water reservoir in Sam Shui Po, right, which they discovered last year, and they preserve it, and it's now ready to open to the public. If it's not for the pandemic, then people actually could go and see it. I had a preview actually in January, February, and it's all done inside, with all the lighting, the walkway, and so on. And then you just mentioned in the lecture about the Roman arches and whether they have the concrete. And I was telling my student, that the underground structure with the column, they look Roman, but they are not Roman because it's modern, right? They have the barrel vault, which is in reinforced concrete. So the Colosseum that you were showing, and then you were commenting on whether they had reinforced concrete reminded me about the lecture this morning. So I think this is one example of a new project in conservation that I think people in Hong Kong would be able to see and maybe how to use it, in future. I think they were still thinking of how to invite operators to use that big space. It is a round shaped space, and I was making just a casual comment. Well, it could be a great wedding banquet hall, and with all these historic structures and wonderful acoustic, maybe it could be a really interesting new venue, So I think your comment on the urban streetscape is a more challenging and more difficult thing to do, in terms of preserving life and integrating with developments and so on. Yeah. So. Dean Tam? Yeah.
I have one question. You mentioned about the high density living, high density lifestyle in China and in Hong Kong. That I think is a very special thing in Asia, in Japan too. We also have a high density cities in Japan. But after the pandemic, do we have to rethink the risk of high density living and high density lifestyle? Now all the shops are closed, and many of the shopping malls have no visitors. So because of the pandemic, so high density may be a risk in our life in the 21st century. So it has its good things about high density living, but there's also too much risk in high density living. So as an architect, how would you look at this?
Yes, there are risks with high density living together in 140 stories tower. As I said, like just now, with the conservation of old buildings, you have to take something and you have to leave something. I think it is going to advance. Hong Kong is not that backward, or even say China. The public housing is not what I'm saying now. I said this 40 years ago. Public housing and ICAC is one of the most important things in Hong Kong. And public housing happens to do well, but the affluent suddenly is to remove it, because people now have to line up for the public housing 10 years before it's better. It's easier once upon a time. And what I'm trying to say is they would have to really sit down and make public housing an impetus, not to just say it and not doing it, because it's not about land price or real estate price. It's two things to me. I think it is rather ambiguous to say that public housing is going to hurt the real estate market. I think there's two different segments. In business school, we call them segments, different segments. Different market segments. And people really have to live. I think I was in Chengdu. Now I remember the capital of Sichuan. I was in Chengdu 1986. And at that time already, those low-cost houses are row by row. They are really like what is written in the books, 10-story high, no elevators, row by row. They are only about perhaps 10 meters apart from each other, 10 stories high, very, very much congested. But at least you have a place to live. You have your dignity, you have your life. I think that's going to happen. That you cannot do away with that. It's two different market segments.
When I actually was attending Alex's lecture last time, I saw his sketches, and then I thought, that it would be a great idea if we are holding this second talk on the subject of architecture and the city and culture, that he will show his drawings at the same time, right? So we were really fortunate, that Alex agrees, and then he really shows a good collection of his drawings. I'm sure, that he still has other drawings which he hasn't included, but I think the selection for the drawings and sketches that he shows this time at our library, I think is a very illustrative visual display of his lecture today, right? And in fact, I think some of the sketches are also shown in the lecture, right? So this is really a rare and unique occasion. I think it's a matter which is very close to his heart, and therefore it also attracts, the loved ones from his family, Mrs. Law, and also his son Edward, who also grace this occasion with their presence. So I think it's really our honor and our pleasure to host both the exhibition as well as the lecture as a full grown event to celebrate what has been so dear to Alex's heart and mind, right? So I think now we have to move over to the gallery and to have the opening of the exhibition. So let's all join the guests and Alex and the dean and everyone. Let's go over. Yeah.
Okay. On behalf of the School of Humanities and Social Science, I would like to thank Alex for letting us organize this exhibition of his drawings. As I have said to some people who came to preview this exhibition, that this is a nostalgic journey of not just Alex, but many of us who have seen the growth of Hong Kong, have seen the development of Hong Kong, the changing landscapes of Hong Kong. At the same time, we also see drawings, sketches of European scenery, and that also shows the cosmopolitanism of Hong Kong. In some other drawings, we also see the tradition, the changing tradition in Hong Kong. So that's why how I would call this a nostalgic journey. And At the same time, I also think that there's a tone of time to use a term to describe. Actually, it's the title of a short story by Henry James also about painting and about history, about memory, about culture, about gender, many things involved in an artist's perspective on changing human relationships. And so today we have a painter's eye on a city. And here we have two painters. So this is a very good occasion. It's just coincidence. It's what Alex calls 萬不經心嘅轉變 unintentional coincidence, not change, unintentional coincidence that we have Desmond organizing everything for another architect. And both of them they have things in common: painting, culture, language, and architecture. So this is really a great occasion. So thank you very much for having us, allowing us to have this exhibition of your drawings.
Well, we have this souvenir from our department, art and design, which is a souvenir of bag and also T-shirt. So we assemble, one white T-shirt in a black bag for Alex. And also, one black T-shirt with a white bag for Edward. Okay.
Yeah, maybe 褪過嚟呢邊少少，用啲畫做背景。
Come over here.
Yeah.
Thank you. So we have three architects, not
Yeah.
two. There are three architects.
Can I ask my wife to join us in the book?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Because she's the painter.
Charles 都影埋相。
Charles. Oh, right. Charles, come here.
Timing.
Okay, 1, 2, 3. Oh, okay. Oh, 1, 2, 3. Oh, 3.我呢度。
呢度。
Oh, thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you to my wife. Because age of 37, I started my first drawing in Japan because she buys a tiny bag. And she is a painter, very hard work. I really unintentional. I don't know how or why these things happen. I really don't know how or why, because most of them are drawn in the hospital. My dad and mom were sick in hospital. Nothing to do, and I draw. And some of them are with her. Most half of them are with her on trips that I wrote. We spend our lives in these things, and Edward is, and even Charles is in some of the pictures. That one in New York City, 3 of us are standing on the street. Yeah. We stand, they don't know what I'm doing. Because he is studying in New York City. I work.
放埋一條線。These are the papers. OK。我放到大都仲睇到呢啲。係啊，犀利。咁我有啲咩嘅？係睇啲。畫一張、兩張、三張，就俾佢啲餐室度嘅，有啲膠紙黐翻。係上面嗰啲係應該大啲嘅。哦，有啲大啲。哦，呢張冇大嘅。呢張縮細嘅。啊！你嗰啲湯真係你派嗰啲湯。哦，有啲係後備請槍嘅。我正路嘅。唔係我都有咩咁啊？好多時有啲又冇啊。係咯，原本呢啲都係好似啲 pencil 嗰啲有少少嘅。呢啲又冇，呢啲又冇 ，especially 呢個好搞。呢張我都冇好搞。呢啲又冇，呢個即係原本都係二班，好多係 travel。好多呢個 Darling Harbour，佢哋唔知㗎，佢哋坐喺度飲緊嘢，我坐喺度。好多字啦。第一次我就啱啱先翻嚟啦，有時間我都好